Thanks for being with us. So welcome to the April 2022 textual study on Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. In this study, we'll be proceeding with consideration of spiritual resurrection in the first 200 years. Last month, we discussed the ways Paul's letters and the Nag Hammadi Treatise laid out spiritual resurrection. Now we'll expand notions of spiritual resurrection in passages about empty tombs and visions. These ideas come earlier than the scientific approaches that result in doctrinal pictures of physical resurrection. Well, before we turn it over to Hal, I do want to remind you that we encourage and appreciate an ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. We really do need your help to keep going. So if you haven't already done so, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a monthly pledge that's just right for you. PayPal or checks are also an option if you prefer. And check the chat box here or the website for details. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And so Hal, let's jump back into the study of the spiritual resurrection. Glad to hear what you've got to say about it tonight.
Thanks so much, Shirley, for being with us and leading us, and for all of you for coming out for a second full session on spiritual resurrection. I've found that this has a lot more depth and complexity than in all kinds of scriptures of the first 2 centuries, and we look forward to dealing with this in some other texts that we haven't treated so far. But just to say briefly where we were when we looked at the thinking and practice of Paul within the New Testament or eventual New Testament, and then the treatise on the resurrection from the Nag Hammadi. It turned out that both of those texts, although one is very well known, especially Paul in 1 Corinthians, and then the resurrection treatise, it turns out that they are very much on very similar levels. And that is this, in some contrast to the way many people in the contemporary world of our time think about resurrection. What was clear from 1 Corinthians was that Paul was proposing resurrection as a major reality, but he said very clearly that the resurrection he was talking about was a spiritual body, not a physical body. When you'll find often people who think they know Paul but have never seen that right at the heart of the 1 Corinthians 15, where we find Paul very clearly saying there have been all kinds of epiphanies, all kinds of appearances of the resurrection. But when you look carefully at the word epiphany, or that means an appearance. And then he quickly goes on to say, it'd be really stupid, he says, literally, if you thought that we were talking about physical resurrection. We're talking about spiritual resurrection. And then he goes further to say that there is a spiritual body that is resurrected. So just for us to see where basically most people start on what is the resurrection, and that's a summary of Paul at the heart of his work in 1 Corinthians. And then the treatise on the resurrection, which is from the Nag Hammadi, is more of like an essay on the resurrection. And there too, that treatise has very much in common with the idea of the spiritual resurrection or the spiritual body of the resurrection in Paul. So that's where we primarily have been in beginning this. And it is an interesting possibility of how to think about resurrection, because there are a lot of different texts. And tonight we're going to go in another way that we haven't done in our last month, and that is to what one might call the basically more of a story about the empty tomb. And so we'll begin there. And here too, I would want to suggest that there are a number of empty tomb kind of stories, both within the eventual New Testament and in beyond the New Testament in other places. And it would be probably a problem for us to think that all of these texts have the same meaning or the same opinion, especially even when we get to the empty tombs. There, it turns out that there's a wide, strange range of stories about the empty tomb. And that they don't line up near as well as Paul and the treatise on the resurrection do about the spiritual resurrection. So hoping for us to take on quite a few texts tonight and see how this does and doesn't line up with Paul and the treatise on the resurrection from the Nag Hammadi. Usually people start in terms of empty tomb with the Gospel of Mark. And there are several things to notice right away about this. And that is that the text of the Gospel of Mark, at the end of the Gospel of Mark, is about as messy and ragged as any book in the New Testament. Many of you know, but it's probably good for me to say this, that the Gospel of Mark doesn't really know where it ends. Or another way of saying it is that the texts, the ancient texts that compose the Gospel of Mark have two different endings. Or no, that's not even true. It has four different endings. And we need to go over that just a little bit because it's confusing to say the least. The first thing to say is there are four different endings of the Gospel of Mark, and the latter three are much later in origins, almost certainly. That is, the most of the texts of the Gospel of Mark only have one ending, and it is the most. Has the most texts supporting it, but because this first ending to the Gospel of Mark was was very problematic for people who read it, and very confused. I would say also beautifully done in a complex way, but it looks like that what happened in the Gospel of Mark is that people didn't like the first and last ending, meaning the real ending to the Gospel of Mark, and basically wrote three others. And the other three that are written and then eventually added to the Gospel of Mark later, the problem there is that those three also disagree with one Let me briefly summarize what I would call the first, and one might say original. I think some people might disagree with me, and that would be a fine conversation for us to have. But let me say that the first and more or less earliest and perhaps original ending to the Gospel of Mark goes this way. It's at the empty tomb. Jesus has died. Jesus has been buried in a tomb. That's the background. And then the story is simply of several women, associates with Jesus, come to the tomb, basically to anoint the body of Jesus, which has died. But interestingly enough, in that story, as the women come to the tomb, they find somebody else there, and it's not Jesus. Matter of fact, Jesus isn't there at all, and that's what a young man who is sitting in the tomb with Jesus's clothes beside him, but no Jesus, says, hey, he's not here. He is risen. He has been risen, and he goes, and he is going to Galilee, where he said he would be. So this is the address to the women who are coming to anoint, the several Marys, and there what we see is the response to the of the women to the idea of Jesus being risen and gone away, and apparently left his clothes. And this is simply this is the last verse of what most scholars think is the main Gospel of Mark. The last thing that is said, and you can see this on the page. Thank you so much, Shirley. The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were frightened. Now, the thing that is not really often understood in terms of manuscripts is that, as far as we can tell, this is the way the Gospel of Mark ends. The women discover that he has been risen and are so trembling and bewildered that they say nothing to anyone because they're too frightened. End of Gospel. So the fascinating thing here is this last story in the Gospel of Mark does not deny the resurrection of Jesus. One has to say, however, with this as the ending, one might say it kind of downplays it. Or at least it's very confusing to the women and to many readers. I have to stay with this just a little bit more, and then we'll stop and talk a little bit about it. But many of us think that Mark chapter 16, verse 8, as the last part of the Gospel of Mark, is really clever. And just let me remind you about the Gospel of Mark and what the Gospel of Mark does throughout the Gospel of Mark. And that is, when Jesus heals someone, almost anyone, Jesus very often, not always, but most of the time, when Jesus has done a healing, Jesus says that the people who he's talking to should not tell anyone. That is, Jesus is saying, don't tell anyone that these people are being healed. So please notice here, right on our screen, basically first we need to know that when Jesus said to so many people, listen, please don't tell anybody that these people are being healed. Now notice what happens in the last verse of the Gospel of Mark. The last thing that someone says is, they don't say anything. In other words, finally, someone, although before everybody ignores Jesus and they tell everybody. Here, for the first time, someone is doing what Jesus said and not telling anyone of the healing. So let's stop here and just think a little bit about this story, this empty tomb story, probably the first empty tomb story, most likely, and maybe the only real one in the Gospel of Mark. I'd love thoughts on this, what this means. I think it means an awful lot, an awful lot positive about the resurrection. But some of you may want to ask questions or have general thoughts about its meaning.
Hal, before we get into that, you might just also mention a little bit about what these other endings do. That's different. I mean, what does it go on and say, just briefly?
Yeah, just briefly, it's these are meetings with Jesus after Jesus is on the road again. Would be the main thing. But what Jesus says does not have any particular theme, or does not have a lot of commonality between the things that he says or they say to him.
I think it sounds so authentic.
It does not sound so authentic.
No, it does sound.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it really sounds authentic to me that would be the response to seeing that the tomb was empty, and the wonder of it, that you just feel it in that last line, and then it sort of gets washed away with the rest of it. So this time when I read it, it felt so right that was the ending. So, yeah, I appreciated it.
Thank you. Yeah, that many people, of course, because we've had another kind of church way of thinking about this. We don't get that shock, do we? Thank you.
I also like this ending. It's my preferred ending to the book of Mark.
Thanks, Anita.
Two things really sort of strike me, though, in those last two. First of all, the telling the women to tell the disciples to go back to Galilee, because it's like, go back to the beginning. And then you have the shock of the empty tomb. And for me, it resonates with, like everything, coming out as transgender. It's like this whole sense of the world is completely different now. Mm-hmm. It is, and it's both exhilarating, but at the same time, it's terrifying, because this is go back to the beginning and do it again, but an entirely different understanding. And so this whole thing of the women running off in terror, it just really resonates with me. It's like there's something more to come, and Mark just leaves it hanging in the air. It's almost like I always thought of Mark as asking a lot of questions and never getting answers. And this is sort of like the final one is, what are you going to do with this? Mm-hmm. And as a Christian, it's sort of it's kind of what I feel like Scripture should be asking us. What are you going to do with this? So that's my sit in the half.
Well, but Anita, thank you so much, because you've taken us the next stage in terms of Scripture study, and you really very tightly showed how this unusual scene has so much to do with the rest of Mark. So another question to ask as we hang in here with this particular very early empty tomb is now to go to Paul and the thesis on the resurrection, both of which underlined the spiritual resurrection and the spiritual body as the character of the resurrected body. I say this slowly because so many of us are moderns. Moderns are really physical about realities. And so many moderns of all sorts and of the more or less Christian types, many of them are shocked because this is not modern physicality at all. And it coheres. In some ways, this is like the primary story that Paul would like someone to be talking about, in which it is a spiritual reality that we're talking about. Now, again, granted, we who are more or less moderns, whether we like it or not, we don't know really how to talk about spiritual realities in many ways, and so I just say this slowly to say that even though there is a shockingness about Gospel of Mark and resurrection, it does cohere in ways that probably we won't see as much for the rest of the evening. Okay, all right. Let's go on if we would. I'm going to just again summarize, because we have so much material to cover. I'm going to summarize several texts from the Gospel of Luke in chapter 24, most of the Gospel of 24 in the Gospel of Luke. This is what one might see in the first 8 verses. This might be what one might see as the Gospel of Mark, but without the strangeness and complexity. Here we have also a first day of the week, going to the tomb, women going to the tomb, and being told by someone, in this case, is kind of ramped up because it's sort of angel-y, what these women are told here is he's not here, he shall be risen, and go tell people. Nothing about women frightened and going away and telling nothing. So the women tell something then. They go, and as they're told to do, they return from the tomb and they go to the 11 and the others, and named here are Mary Magdalene, Johanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. So they do tell the disciples, whoever they exactly are, 11 in this case, but no one believes them. So very interestingly, again here, where we thought the story was going right for contemporary Americans, here we've got another problem on our hands, in that we do have people who, in the story level, have experienced that Jesus is risen, and are going back, as they should, to tell the leaders. But in this case, it doesn't work. Again, not because they're afraid, but because nobody believes them. I frankly want to just notice how lovely this is in terms of the larger gender-bended reality of the early Christ people. So in other words, here you have, often, as is often the case in the Gospels, you have very dependable and important leaders that are women. And you have then the gender bendedness of this, in that they know the real thing, and the people who are supposed to be in charge don't believe it, don't trust it. And then we have, right after that, Peter says, "Oh, I'm going to go look," and Peter solves everything in that regard. So, in other words, Peter goes to the tomb, sees and runs and looks down and sees the linen cloth, but nothing else. And he comes back amazed at how this is amazing. In other words, he changes his tune himself. So just for us to notice here too, we have got complexity, not heroicism or happy endings the way many of us Americans would like it. Okay, so the next thing in Luke, right after this, is another sort of empty tomb story, but it's not quite. Here you have two people from the Jesus people, basically on a long walk, going somewhere, and there's some debate as to whether this is a man and a woman or two men. I won't go down that stream because we never get out of it, at least in time. Here, what happens is these two persons are going along their path, and then they are joined by an anonymous person, which we in the story know is Jesus. And there's a long conversation that goes on as they're walking, it's as if in the story Jesus acts like he doesn't know what's happened, acts like he doesn't know that he was crucified and risen, and they don't recognize him. And then he explains a whole bunch of things to them. Still, it looks like without them recognizing him. Notice here, yet now in a third kind of sort of empty tomb story, we've got misadventures in terms of recognizing. And then finally, they decide to go inside together, the three of them, and have a meal and continue talking. And then when Jesus blesses the meal and breaks the bread, they recognize who he is, and then he disappears. and then they go back again to tell other Jesus people that Jesus has risen. So here also I want us to notice that this is kind of a comedy of errors so far in all three of the empty tomb stories, inasmuch as we have Jesus not recognizing, or at least not acting like Jesus recognizes his followers and they not his. However, there's a kind of this is probably the most happy resurrection or empty tomb that we have seen so far, in that for a minute they recognize each other and then he's gone. So one would I think want to notice, to a certain extent, none of these stories fit together as empty tombs. Different things happen very dramatically. In some cases, they're really arguing with each other about it, whether it matters or not. And in this case, there's a misadventure in whether Jesus and the followers know each other, except just very briefly. Here again, I would want to say that it looks to me like there's a possibility, and this is not just me, a lot of folks are assuming that these Gospels and the Gospels written with an empty tomb in them are written much later than Paul. So maybe many folks these days think that this Lucan set of stories is not until the 2nd century. But Mark probably is not earlier than the late 60s or early 70s. Therefore, and Paul, of course, is working in the 40s and 50s. So notice how long this is strung out. There we have both a commonality of misadventures and misunderstandings, and almost seeing, maybe just a little seeing here in this final one. And so the differences of empty tomb stories, as well as similarities even about flesh that is spiritual, not physical. All of those things. It seems I would love to have us think a little bit about, what do we make so far of empty tombness in relationship to Paul and the resurrection treatise, or just by themselves?
So Lisa, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have always, well, first of all, it's funny to me that the women are just such foible, sort of the comedic characters here. But I've always really marveled that Mary Magdalene was the first one to see the risen Christ. And I feel like, she experienced a healing that maybe the disciples didn't. I don't recall any healings of disciples, but I just have always thought that it was her spirituality after that healing that enabled her to actually to see the risen Christ. So even though it's rather comedically presented here, it's always been a very special part of the story for me that that these women were there. They were, and they were privileged with this encounter. And Mary, to me, it's always been a very special part of the I don't call it the empty tomb story. I call it the resurrection story, that she was able to see him and the disciples were not. And I just think that's just speaks to the quality of transformation in her character that he was able to affect on her.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes. And you'll notice that as we were trying to figure out what we could look at tonight, we actually, this is only in John, the Mary, when Mary and Jesus meet each other alone. And then they also have their kind of own comedies about whether they touch or not. So there's more for us to talk about relative to the larger picture of John that we may not get to. But yes, I think that you've noticed again, Lisa, here another different kind of story, and this has to a certain extent a little bit more summariness about it, or a little bit more connection, as I think what if I was hearing you say, and there's still some misunderstanding, but clearly much it's about the most triumphant story one gets in resurrections in the Bible. All of them are a little bit funny, but this is fairly straightforward. There's just a little bit of disagreement about the two in that regard, but that's very helpful for us to.
Well, could I say something about Mark and Luke? I mean, could it just be that because men were just so dismissive of women that, maybe they tailored the end of the tales to discount the woman's contribution to this moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a fair amount of scholarship that does say that. And so that's then certainly is a major possibility. The problem about that is that Mark has stunning women in Mark's stories all along, probably the best ones. And I mean, including the one who corrects Jesus for calling her a dog. The problem that would end that way when Mark is so consonant in showing up the disciples with the women in almost every turn. You have that would be my puzzle, whether at the end there's an editorial thing that has so much cleverness to it in terms of the healing. But yeah, I don't think we want to take it off the table.
I'd like to ask something. I'm sorry. I tried to raise my hand and it's not working for me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, it's just,
I'll look for it.
Zoom acts up sometimes.
Okay, anyway.
Actually, though, even with Mark, it was Mary Magdalene who saw the empty tomb. So the female is still acknowledged as the one that could see, the one that went looking. Jesus had told them often enough that he would rise up on the third day, and yet, of course, I don't think Mary was expecting it. She was expecting to come take care of his body. But anyway, and also the fact that he did tell her, go tell them, I'll see them in Galilee. And of course, the morning meal in Galilee is one of my favorite texts in the New Testament, but it's not Mark. So, that could be what he was referring to. That he was, but, that you have to travel. I was disturbed, I think I'm going to say, last month about your interpretation of some of these things, Hal. And it occurred to me afterwards, well, maybe you're not discounting a physical resurrection. You're just saying there's more to the concept of resurrection than we may have considered. But now I'm still wondering, do you believe in a physical resurrection? Or are you saying, no, everybody's talking about a spiritual resurrection and we just don't realize it because this is a material age?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly.
But that's really helpful. Thank you. And I would say in terms of Mark that it is is very close in some ways to the complexity of reality in Paul as well. And so for me, it's whether I get Paul and Mark is the first question. In other words, I don't trust my modern self to get all of that, but it seems to me that what is clear is that they're messing with what we moderns think of as what's real. And I myself, when I look at the term that's translated believe, in Greek it's much closer to trust. And so I think only from my point of view, it's only after the creeds of the 4th century that Greek word gets puzzled around and made into a mostly believe thing, rather than what I think in most of the Gospels is about do you trust? Do you trust in it? And so that's what I'm working on now, not in an access, or not in not caring about creedalism later, but knowing that it looks like for the first 2 centuries they're just enamored of what it would be, is it like to trust in the realities, and I would say the resurrection realities that are just stunning in these early stories, and as well as Paul, who doesn't have much story to him at all.
Hillary just brought up the question, and I was going to say something too. I have never thought in the story of the walk to Emmaus that Jesus didn't recognize them. I only felt like they didn't recognize him. And he was gently leading them by walking them through the scriptures that predicted his coming to open their eyes. So I was kind of surprised when you said he didn't recognize them either until that moment at the breaking of bread. I think he knew exactly who they were. But anyway, that's...
Yeah, no, that's good. Let's stay with that a bit. It seems to me that the story is so powerful we get such a really amazing portrait of those guys walking along the road, and that's what really holds Luke together there for me, is that yes, I don't think that it doesn't seem to me as if it was just about proving to Jesus that he was there, he wouldn't have left. It's still a very tricky and a story that asks the question, do you trust?
Well, I guess I just have one other short comment and then I'll be quiet. To me, Hal, if there had not been a physical resurrection and people actually seeing Jesus, and yes, he was clearly not wholly human at that point. His ability to just show up in a room without going through a door, his ability to just show up on the Sea of Galilee and have fish and bread, from what source? I just feel like had something not incredibly remarkable happened, what became Christianity never could have happened. People were crucified all the time. So there was no big deal in being crucified. Obviously, if you were the one, that would be a very big deal. But there's nothing unusual in being crucified. It's the fact that he was resurrected that was so powerful. And I just kind of feel like where you're going with the spiritual meaning is just taking all the power out of what had to be there to have Christianity make any sense to me. And I'm not talking about trusting or believing. I'm just saying something truly dramatic had to have happened for these disciples who were so meek and so frightened to suddenly be bold enough to go and preach in the temple when the Sanhedrin wants to throw them in jail. Anyway, I think it just wouldn't have happened without something incredibly dramatic and different and unexpected. But anyway, I've said my 2 cents.
Thanks. Yeah. And it's just such a for me just such a powerful set of stories about loss. That's what all of the stories go that way. And so, yeah, I'm probably not going to give up on a complicated thing for us folks who are in a different crisis than they were, to not take that as a drama. I think that crucifixion and loss is real drama. Okay, so let's go on. Let's see. I would like to now go to the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is really stunning in terms of resurrection, in that resurrection is never mentioned. So actually, in even more thoroughly, even though the Gospel of Thomas has shown us so much since it was discovered almost 100 years ago, and is still really teaching a lot. The crucifixion and resurrection do not exist in all of the 114 sayings of Jesus. So most scholars have been saying, okay, well, this is another kind of proclamation that's coming from the Gospel of Thomas. I think I want us to look at this one text. There are several that are very interesting in terms of when we think about spiritual resurrection, and that's the 30th, the last part of the 30th saying of Jesus. He says this: lift the stone up, and you will find me there. Split the piece of wood, and I'll find you there. That's about the closest we get to a crucifixion resurrection in the Gospel of Thomas. He's generally a powerful, clever carrier of God, and he is mostly interested in the way teaching happens. to people in that regard. But here, that's where scholars have left the Gospel of Thomas mostly. But this text here is repeated twice in two different places, and it's the appearance of Jesus in the middle, under a rock, or in the middle of a piece of wood. And so I love us to think about, because from the Thomas crowd, we don't get much on this front. They seem to just jump over this appearance out of the heart of reality. And he doesn't say anything except, "I'm here." So let's, in other words, if some of us would like to simply say, "This is we get what we get from the Gospel of Thomas is just this powerful set of 114 sayings, half of which we don't know," and let's just forget about Jesus being in a piece of wood or a rock. So I'd love for you all to say, does this seem like any kind of meaning making in terms of spiritual resurrection? What you hear me asking is to let me push the great scholars of the Gospel of Thomas a little bit to say, wait a minute, you're saying there's no resurrection and no crucifixion here. Is there something to spiritual resurrection in this text or not?
Hal, could you just define what you mean when you say spiritual resurrection?
I think I'm still working on it, Lisa.
Oh,
Thanks for that. I think I'm only part of the way there, but what I do know is that most of my modern colleagues, scholars or not, are adverse to it. And I'm finding it under all kinds of rocks in these texts. So I would also then say probably that what's important here is that it looks like there is a unclear mix of what the texts themselves mean about both resurrection and spirituality. In other words, we've gone too far to think that that all of these texts mean the same thing. And Irenaeus, when he said for the first time, we think, let's have 4 gospels, they said that not because they were all the same, because they were all different. As he said, there are 4 winds that blow there, and there are 4 corners to the earth. So I think what spiritual resurrection means is multiform, and the more diversity on that, the better for me.
It seems Hillary has her hand up there too.
But Joy, did you need to say something back? I was plodding along with her.
Okay, I'll say something, Hal. I was really excited about the discussion of resurrection in the treatise of the resurrection.
Me too.
And I'm really sorry that we didn't continue on that.
Yeah.
That you went on a total different tangent. We're not talking about spiritual resurrection. We're talking about how people saw the resurrection. And I'm really sorry because there's this huge amount of discussion about what spiritual resurrection is versus physical resurrection in that treatise. And I'm just really disappointed we didn't go further in that.
Yeah, I apologize. I was just in love with that. And I felt like we had more material and more to cover. And as we talked about which next, that could have been a mistake because, hardly anybody knows the treatise on the resurrection. And that's one of the things that I was really mourning. So thanks for that.
We have two points here. We have Hillary's hand up and then a comment from Kathy Fields in the chat. So do you want to take Hillary?
I wanted to say that to me, spiritual resurrection is the recognition that life is eternal. And here, sitting in this material world, we can't see that. But to me, as one really understands what Jesus was teaching, it's an acknowledgement that this human experience is kind of a blip along the way, but life is eternal. And yes, there's a purpose to human experience to learn to be all the spiritual qualities that we need. But to me, spiritual resurrection is that acknowledgement that there is more after this mortal human experience. And I have to say, too, having been with someone dear to me who passed at that time, the recognition that came to me very shortly after was, we don't know what resurrection looks like. And of course, this person didn't lift off into the sky, but in every way, I sensed a resurrection taking place there, and in thought of that individual, and that they were moving on to find their true spiritual identity. And it just was so clear to me that how can I say they didn't resurrect, because I don't know what it looks like. So that was just thought I had.
Yeah, that's of course a nice sitting beside me on that. And Hillary, would you have another sentence or two in which you would join the rest of us in pausing about the values of physical versus spiritual resurrection?
I think that Jesus resurrecting body was important, because I do think Christianity wouldn't be what it is today, because that was a sure shocker. The fact that he could go through crucifixion, be buried in a tomb, get out of that tomb, come back and appear to them and say, this is what it's all about. Get your act together and start, healing and preaching and doing this. So I think in that case, yes, it was important that there was a physical resurrection. And, you go back to the story of Elijah disappeared, and there are a couple of others in the Bible. And I think that those are important, were important episodes to teach us something, what's possible, but maybe it was just that what's going on with the physical is just really not that big a deal. Not the everything. I guess I should put it that way. It's not the everything. And we just need to be aware of that. So that's sort of how I see it.
Thanks. Shirley, I think you said you saw somebody else.
Well, I'm just saying in the chat, we just have, since we're running close on the time here, but Kathy Fields has said, perhaps Thomas's gospel is saying, you'll find me when you abandon your idols. I don't know, Hal, it's a little after the hour here.
Yeah, well, we knew that we were, we didn't even get to the Gospel of Mary.
I know. So.
And that's a long chapter.
A long, beautiful chapter.
Yeah, very long, beautiful chapter. You want to give us a little treat about what's coming next?
Well, all right. Next month, we're going to take a look at one of the most important writings from the Nag Hammadi collection, The Secret Revelation of John. And I'll be leading those next two discussions based on my brand new book on the subject. So for next month, I'm excited to share some of the incredible gems that I've discovered in the book. And then the month after that, we'll be talking about demons and why they matter to us. So we've got lots of things to talk about. I do want to encourage our further discussion on resurrection, which is so rich and deep, and we could go forever on this. Please have these conversations on the Facebook page. That's what it's there for. So if you haven't found your way, it's Early Christian Text Conversations, and Hal does a really good job of responding when you ask questions, even though he's not on Facebook. I send them to Hal, and he answers. So we can keep the conversation going there. So thanks for being with us tonight. There's so much wonderful stuff to talk about, and I hope we can keep on hearing from you. So I guess we'll have to say goodbye. This has been the April 2022 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussions, proceeding with consideration of spiritual resurrection in the first 200 years, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month at 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the fourth of the month, we provide a discussion of one of the early Christian texts or more of them. Dr. Hal Taussig usually leads these sessions, sharing a well-framed overview of the particular text and allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. As you know, we do rely on your donations to be able to produce these textual studies. We're so grateful to those of you who've already pledged your support via Patreon. And if you've not yet become a member, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a pledge that's just right for you. PayPal or check is also an option if you prefer. Check out the website, earlychristiantext.com, for details. I think that's it, Hal. Any final words you want to say?
Thanks to everybody.
All right. Thanks so much. Great to see you all.